In these environments, the interrogator becomes the anchor. They are the only predictable presence, the only stable element, the only source of clarity. Compliance is no longer perceived as submission, but as control. Speaking becomes a way to restore agency rather than surrender it. Cooperation feels like a choice rather than an obligation. This is why the technique leaves no visible scars. The body is untouched. The damage, if any, occurs internally. From the outside, the interaction appears voluntary, even cooperative. From the inside, resistance has simply become unsustainable. Importantly, this method also protects the interrogator. There is no moment of force, no single action that can be identified as abuse, no clear line where legality is crossed. Responsibility is diffused across environment, routine, and time. The technique does not rely on breaking the subject. It relies on letting the subject adapt. An adaptation, under these conditions, is mistaken for consent. After the war, Britain denied the use of coercive interrogation. Technically, this was true. There were no bruises, no broken bones, no visible scars. Only results. Reports described cooperative subjects, voluntary disclosures, interviews conducted without force. Many related files remain sealed. Others were destroyed entirely. What survives suggests intent, but not accountability. The techniques were never formalized, never officially named, never publicly defended. They did not need to be. They existed in the space between legality and deniability, where effectiveness could be claimed without responsibility. Some interrogation methods do not break the body. They simply remove the will to resist. This file was never meant to be found. This was Shadow Archives. When they did appear, their demeanor was always the same. Calm, polite, professional. They did not behave as adversaries. They did not raise their voices. They did not issue threats. They spoke as administrators, as men conducting routine business. Questions were casual. Conversation felt optional. There were no ultimatums. The subject was never told they had to cooperate. No demand was made for immediate disclosure. And yet, the method worked. In the absence of structure, the mind destabilizes. Memory loses sequence. Thoughts begin to circle. Anxiety grows without a clear source. The silence becomes oppressive not because it is violent, but because it is unending. Eventually, speaking becomes relief. Not because the interrogator demands it, but because silence becomes unbearable. Answering questions restores a sense of structure. Conversation reintroduces sequence. Speaking rebuilds time. The subject believes they are choosing to talk. That belief is the mechanism. Because the subject feels in control, resistance collapses without ever being challenged directly. Modern psychology identifies this process as cognitive destabilization. Human cognition depends on structure. Time, routine, and predictability allow the brain to regulate stress, maintain memory, and preserve a sense of agency. When those reference points disappear, the mind searches for anchors. This design produced a subtle but powerful effect. Without a sense of time, the mind loses its ability to pace itself. Fatigue becomes difficult to interpret. Anxiety lacks a clear cause. Thoughts begin to loop without resolution. Importantly, nothing in these environments could be easily identified as physical abuse. There were no bruises to document, no injuries to explain, no visible signs that would trigger oversight or investigation. From the outside, these facilities appeared orderly, professional, even humane. From the inside, they were destabilizing. The environment itself became the interrogator. Time lost meaning. Expectation collapsed. The subject no longer knew how long they had been held, how long they would remain, or what behavior would change their circumstances. This uncertainty was not a byproduct. It was the design. The core principle behind this approach was simple. A subject who cannot measure time cannot endure it. Prisoners were isolated completely. There was no indication of day or night, no predictable schedule, no reliable sense of duration. Meals arrived without warning. Sleep was interrupted without explanation. Silence stretched for hours, sometimes longer. Interrogators appeared irregularly, sometimes after hours, sometimes after days. Many files end abruptly. References point to materials that no longer exist. Marginal notes refer to annexes that were later removed. In some cases, entire years of documentation are simply absent. This absence is not accidental. British intelligence culture during the war prioritized deniability. Methods that could not be defended publicly were rarely formalized. Practices that existed in legal gray zones were kept deliberately informal, passed through training, precedent, and experience rather than written doctrine. As a result, what survives today is not a clear blueprint, but a pattern. Repeated references to rooms without clocks, to lighting that never changed, to strict regulation of sleep, sound, and routine. Not interrogation as confrontation, but interrogation as atmosphere. The records do not describe what was done to prisoners. They describe the conditions in which prisoners were placed. And those conditions tell us everything. The physical environments used for interrogation were designed with a specific purpose. Cells were intentionally stripped of temporal reference points. There were no clocks, no windows, and no predictable markers distinguishing day from night. Artificial lighting was kept constant. Meals arrived at irregular intervals. Sleep was interrupted inconsistently. Routine was not enforced. It was dissolved. Guards were instructed to limit unnecessary interaction. Movements were logged carefully, but conversation was kept minimal. The goal was not intimidation, but disorientation. By the time the prisoner realized he was being interrogated, the interrogation was already over. There had been no threats, no raised voices, no visible pressure, no confession signed in ink, no record of resistance, no moment where force was applied. Only silence and compliance. During the Second World War, Britain publicly rejected coercive interrogation. Official doctrine emphasized restraint, legality, and humane treatment. Interrogation, according to policy, relied on patience, professionalism, and time. This position was not incidental. It was strategic. Britain framed itself as an intelligence power that understood persuasion rather than force. An intelligence service that gathered information without brutality. An institution fundamentally different from the regimes it opposed. This distinction mattered. Britain was fighting a war not only of territory, but of legitimacy. To admit coercive interrogation would undermine that image. It would collapse the moral distance Britain claimed to maintain. For decades after the war, this narrative endured. But internal records tell a quieter story. Fragmentary, heavily redacted, often indirect. They do not describe beatings. They do not describe overt violence. There are no instructions to strike prisoners, no procedural manuals for torture, no explicit orders demanding confessions. Instead, the documents speak in abstractions. environment, control, timing, isolation.